In the second part of our topic on climate impact, we'll look at the role of technology in de-risking conservation. Luis Alberto Moreno, former Inter-American Development Bank president and member of the Latin American Conservation Council, will guide the discussion with former U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, now chairman of the Paulson Institute. Let's join Luis and Secretary Paulson for the second part of the discussion around climate impact and the response of the financial sector.
Good morning and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're listening to us. It's my distinct pleasure today to have with us former Secretary Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, a dear friend and somebody who has had a very distinguished career, not only in public service, but equally in the private sector as chairman of Goldman Sachs, and more recently in the Paulson Institute doing amazing work as it relates to one of his great passions, which is climate change. But it doesn't stop there. I mean, he's been a great observer and perhaps one of the most acute observers on U.S.-China relations and really the situation of the world economy. So let's start, Hank, talking a little bit about the U.S.-China relations today. How would you characterize them and how you see that relationship evolving, especially under a new Biden administration?
Well, Luis Alberto, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. You and I have done a lot together, and again, I'm looking forward to it. So, the U.S.-China relationship is a fraught relationship. It's as fraught as I've ever seen it. And I think it's going to be difficult for the foreseeable future. There's no doubt in my mind that the President-elect Biden has got a good team around him, that they'll have a different approach, that there'll be less inflammatory language, policy will be more predictable, it'll be more consistent and comprehensive. But the basic issues are structural. In Washington, there's bipartisan concern about China, okay? And it's widespread concern, and it's largely structural. You know, you have a established power, and you have a rising power with a different ideology, a different political system, a different economic system. And so I think it's fair to say that competition is baked into the relationship. It's going to be a cornerstone of the relationship, and it's economic competition. And so what we need to work to do is to keep that competition healthy, to keep it from becoming pernicious and spinning out of control. And what we need to be more competition with less unnecessary confrontation, because what we've seen to date is confrontation without good competition hasn't yielded much in the way of results. Now, the competition, a few more words about the competition. Technology is at the center of this competition. There's a race for each country to establish the technologies of the future that are going to underpin the growth in the global economy. And that's not going to be negotiated, that's going to be determined in the marketplace. And so the biggest concern I've had is that my country, the United States, in looking to protect their national security, and we're going to have to, there's no doubt, we're going to have to sequester certain technologies to protect national security. But my biggest concern is we might go too far there. And in attempting to constrain China, we hurt ourselves, because if we sequester too much technology, then U.S. companies and U.S. researchers don't participate in global research. We don't. Our companies can't participate in value chains for some of the supply chains for some of the fastest growing industries. So, in summary, I think this is going to be a difficult relationship for the foreseeable future. Right now, it's chaotic because there's been no determination of where we're going to compete and where we're going to cooperate. I think we'll see a different approach to that. And I think that the relationship will be on a more stable footing once we've worked out where we're going to compete and where we're going to cooperate. But it's going to be an important and a difficult relationship for some time.
Hank, I remember listening to you in a recent speech at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum that you spoke about targeted reciprocity. Do you think there is a space there to begin under a new Biden administration to move precisely along the lines that you suggested then?
Yes, Luis Alberto. So what I'd said in that speech was that a cornerstone of the Trump policy was to reciprocity, was to, and it sounds great at 100,000 feet. If we don't have access to China's markets, they shouldn't have access to our markets. Do unto them as they would do unto us. But of course, when you've got a largely open economy like we have and a closed economy, one that's closed to a greater extent like China's economy is, then if we behave like China and close ourselves off in response to China, we're not playing to our strength, which is innovation. And so the way I look at it is this way, that a lot of the diagnoses that the Trump administration made about the problem were really quite accurate, largely accurate. But their solutions, I think, I don't agree with many of the solutions, because many of the solutions, in policies that they espoused in attempting to constrain or to harm China, they're doing more damage to the United States. And so I'd like to see targeted reciprocity aimed at opening markets where we're most competitive, and there's plenty of opportunities there.
So let's turn over to something that I know has been your passion for many years, and is that of climate change. You, through the Paulson Institute, have been working with China around issues of climate change. Well, not only limited to China, you equally have done many things in Latin America as well. But as a new day starts with a Biden administration that is focused in joining the Paris Agreement, how do you see that cooperation between China and the United States around climate change? Because it's going to be one of the key pillars as we think of the next Committee of the Parties that will happen in Ireland next year.
Luis Alberto, well said. And this is an area where you've done a lot of work, where we've worked together. We've both worked with China. We both know the Biden administration. So it's clear that climate change is going to be a key part of the Biden agenda. It's going to be baked into the domestic policy, and climate diplomacy is going to be a big part of the international agenda. And Biden has already named my friend John Kerry to be his climate envoy. And there's no doubt, as you said, the U.S. is going to rejoin the Paris Agreement, which is important. But I believe that that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Voluntary targets aren't going to be enough. And so I think there's plenty of room for the U.S. and China to work together and coming up with some new mechanisms. And I'd like to see one focused on major economies where it makes a real difference. I'd like to see a mechanism with teeth in it, okay, and that deals directly with the problem of free riding and provides real incentives for companies to reduce carbon emissions. And then there's plenty of ways in which we can work together. That the United States is great at innovation. We have more clean energy patents than any country in the world. China can commercialize and roll these out and scale faster than any place in the world. There's great opportunities to work together there. I think the Biden administration should be pushing China to eliminate or reduce tariffs on environmental goods and services. And I think that's opening up a big market in China, and where there's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar market in China to continue cleaning up the environment. So again, a lot of areas to work together. And I think that's actually, although climate change, there's nothing bright about climate change. I mean, that's the biggest risk I think the biggest and most certain economic risk the world faces. It's a formidable risk, and it's a battle we're losing. but it's a battle we can't make progress on unless the U.S. and China are working together. So I think that's a real area for cooperation. But I don't believe that working together on climate change should be enough to give China a free ride on other economic issues.
And you're so right. I mean, in fact, earlier this week, Secretary Antonio Gutierrez pointed to the fact that we're already at 2.2 degrees, and within half a degree, we would be already hitting the Paris Agreement kind of accord. So we have, like you say, to really raise in this regard. And the U.S.-China agreement, of course, will lead to really shaping a lot of what can happen going forward next year. Let's turn over to another area that you've talked about a lot as it relates to China and the U.S., and it's this whole notion of financial decoupling. And of course, the risk that can happen. And tell us how you're seeing this issue evolving, and how could it be different under a new Biden administration?
Well, Luis Alberto, I talked about the pressure to decouple in technology and the dangers there. But this has bled over into many other areas, and we're seeing increasing pressure to decouple, across the economic spectrum. And we're even seeing pressure to decouple in finance, which I think is a very bad idea. But I want to begin by saying China is really showing every indication of opening up its financial markets to international competition. And I really urge them to go ahead and do that, because I think it'll be good for China, good for the people of China, and good for the world. And I'm still a bit nervous about that because there's strong vested interests, and I think they've been going a bit slow. But putting that aside, let's look at it from the U.S. There's pressure from the U.S. side for U.S. There's pressure for delisting Chinese companies, for U.S. Investors not to invest in Chinese equities, to knock China out of the indexes, MSCI equity index. And I want to begin with the basic principle. I'm a capitalist, and I think it's wrong for government to tell private investors how they invest private capital for private ends. But going beyond that, part of the discussion in the U.S. is about Chinese accounting, and there's no doubt that needs to improve. But I think there is a compromise, plenty of things that can be done there to solve the problem for Chinese companies that are listed on U.S. exchanges. And I think that the SEC and under the Biden administration needs to work to resolve that, because unless something goes terribly wrong in China, they very soon are going to have more major companies, more major global companies than any nation on earth. And if those companies aren't listed on exchanges in the U.S., we're going to lose our leadership position in this area. There are plenty of countries and plenty of places where they would love to have those companies listed, whether we're talking about Tokyo or whether we're talking about Singapore or Shanghai or Hong Kong or London or Brussels. So again, I do think U.S. leadership in capital markets is very important to our country. It's very important to the primacy of the dollar. It's very important to our competitiveness. I don't think fracturing it or segmenting that is good for the world or good for global growth. The other thing I would say when we talk about financial decoupling, the United States is heavily reliant on China as a major purchaser of our debt securities at a time when we're increasing our deficit, issuing more debt. And I don't see decoupling there as being good for the United States or good for China or good for the world.
One other area, of course, and it's been very much a part of this seminar we're in today, is the whole issue of fintech. And there's a tremendous development taking place around fintech. You've observed for a long time everything around financial services. And really one of the fascinating things to watch is how fintechs are really exploding all over, especially in emerging markets. Tell us a little bit about how do you see those developments taking place, and what are your worries around them?
Okay, well, first of all, boy, what an area. And this is something you and I have talked about a lot. because fintech is changing the face of finance all around the world. It's a revolutionary technology. It's a disruptive technology. And it's a technology that's got really making advances in terms of efficiency, in terms of convenience. I really like what it's doing in terms of accessibility and inclusion, because I think it's bringing the unbanked, and it's got the potential to do even more to bring unbanked peoples into the financial ecosystem. So I think that is very, very powerful. And then, of course, in the areas you and I, a lot of the areas you and I have been focusing on in terms of climate change or the environment, this is a very powerful tool. And I think we're just seeing the early days, because when I think of fintech, I think of innovation, okay? And that's the frontier of innovation. And so I think there's a lot that can be done. And we're seeing that just a few things I've looked at that, and I could cite a good number of them. There's been a lot that's been done in China. And you can see case studies there on the Paulson Institute website. But one example was when Ant set up their affinity group for the environment, Ant Forest. It's been pretty amazing. They have over 500 million, users. And what this does is lets individuals track their carbon footprint. Now just imagine the potential in all sorts of areas, or the new financing techniques that are apt to come out of this. So to me, that's amazing. But the one thing that I warn about, and I saw this going through the financial crisis in 2008 in the US, regulation almost always lags innovation. And boy, we saw it big time in the US financial crisis. This wasn't fintech, but it was still regulation lagging innovation. All the emergency powers we had in place and the regulations dealt with the world as it evolved after the Great Depression, and dealing with the runs on banks. And so there was all kinds of powers and things that were done in terms of deposit insurance and so on to stabilize banks. But by the time we had the financial crisis, 60% of the credit was flowing outside of banks. And we had $3.5 trillion in money markets. We had a big repo market, all kinds of shadow banking markets. And I'll tell you, we didn't have the authorities to deal with that. So what I say about fintech is technology can do all kinds of things. And, one other problem, if you've got a bad idea, it doesn't create systemic problems because it goes nowhere. But if you have a good idea, that can create real problems because you could have too much of a good idea, right? And so we saw it with mortgage securitization. We saw it in all sorts of areas. And so technology can do all sorts of things. But let me tell you, it's not going to outlaw economic gravity. You need cushions and financial cushions to protect against, against panics in the financial systems or big disruptions. And so that's another area where I think China has done some things that show that they're aware of that. Okay, and they've taken some actions that show that they're aware of that. And to just talk a little bit about, because as we're talking about risks, I'll just say a thing or two about the financial system in China right now, because everyone obviously is looking at the big markets, and China is one, and it's very important that there be stability. And I think one thing people should feel very comfortable about, or not, maybe not comfortable, but feel good about, is that if you look at the latest 5-year plan from China, there's a big emphasis on managing financial risks. And so they're looking at that very hard. You see a situation where they didn't use the big bazooka fiscal stimulus like they did in 2008, because the virus started in China. They've contained it. So they're ahead of the rest of the world in their economic recovery. They've been able to keep interest rates pretty high. And, the currency relatively strong, I think, is good. But I think one thing that the world will look at over time and become increasingly obvious is something you and I have talked about a lot, right? We've talked about how hard Latin America has been hit, and certain emerging markets just been devastated in terms of the mortality, in terms of the economic risks. And if you look at the debt, the bilateral debt, 60% of that is debt that owed to China. That's more than the World Bank, the IMF, all the OECD countries. That's 6% of global GDP. And so I think you're going to see pressure on China over time and a spotlight on China to make some concessions there and to make more concessions. But fintech, I don't want to end on the regulatory note, because to me, the potential there is huge. And I think we're just beginning. I think this is at the early stages of fintech. So I'm really, really pleased. And some of the innovation we're seeing coming out of fintech in a variety of areas. We could talk about digital currencies. We could talk about a lot of things here. But again, an exciting platform.
No question. And like you say, this is the new frontier. It's a good idea. It's a question of how you shepherd and make it go forward. But let's turn for a minute of some of the work that you've done at the Paulson Institute. You recently produced a whole report on financing for nature, which basically makes the case for financing biodiversity. Talk to us a little bit about that, because speaking of China, as we know very well, there's going to be a COP precisely to talk about biodiversity in China that was supposed to be this year, but of course, given COVID, had to be pushed back. But talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, again, this is something you and I have worked on together, and you've been one of my teachers there when some of the work you've done at the IDB. So I'm proud of this report that the Paulson Institute did with the Nature Conservancy in Cornell, because I think it was groundbreaking in terms of the economic case it made for preserving and protecting natural capital and biodiversity. And I bet few people that are listening to this conversation today recognize that we're going through a devastating period in terms of the destruction of biodiversity. This is maybe the greatest extinction episode we've seen, in the history of the world. We're seeing species declining or disappearing, going extinct at 1,000 times the natural rate. At this rate, if this continues, half of the species, and I'm talking about fish, animals, insects, birds, plants, half of the species on Earth will be gone by mid-century. And there's a number of reasons why this is happening, but I would call attention to one, and that is our political systems, our economic systems, our financial markets don't properly account for them. It's hard to put an economic value. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to put an economic value on natural capital. And so it's often not done. And when it's not done, politicians and other decision makers treat it like a free good, right? And if it's a free good, there's no reward given in our system to those that preserve it and protect it. There's no penalty for those that damage it. There's a big short-term incentive to maximize economic gains, immediate economic gains, and not take into account the long-term cost to the well-being of society and to long-term prosperity. So what this study did is took a real deep dive. We looked at the flows into conservation globally, And then we looked at all of the different financing mechanisms for financing nature and case studies. So we really drilled down. And we came up with a big number of financing that was needed to address this problem. It was 800 billion annually. Now that used to just sound just huge to me, but looking at the $4 trillion in fiscal stimulus we've had in the U.S., it doesn't seem quite as large today. But the point that I emphasize to people when I'm talking about this is a lot can be done without any new money. It just comes down to government policies. For instance, half of that amount or more could be accounted for if we just rearranged, restructured these flawed government policies or incentives, in very harmful incentives in three areas: ag, fisheries, and forestry. And you could still get the production there. You just have to restructure those things so they don't incentivize the wrong things. The other thing where you've been, I think, the leader at the IDB, the leader around the world, is looking at principles and risks around the financial system. So what we have right now, if we can make improvements in terms of having the banks and other financial institutions have a better understanding and put in place better practices to identify the risks to biodiversity from loans and investments. And I think you could put in some practices on on either a mandatory or voluntary basis that shines a light on this. And so I think it makes it easier for anyone to take a look and say whether this loan or this investment is going to harm biodiversity or whether it's going to protect it. And so I think there's a lot that can be done there. And I just give you and the IDB a lot of credit for what you've done there.
Well, thank you very much for that, Hank. And, going back to China, I mean, over the years, you've done a lot of work precisely on this space on conserving coastal wetlands or equally sustainable value chains, which you referenced earlier, and green finance. When you look at some of this work that you've done in China, which really has been frontier work, what would you say are the lessons that you've achieved and that other parts of the world, and especially similar topics, can be dealt with in Asia from looking at the work you've done and things that clearly are ways to cooperate with China, not only from the perspective of the US, but really the world over?
So, Luis Alberto, good. I want to talk about that, but I'm going to leg into that by talking about the importance of the private sector, okay? Because the amount of capital it's going to take to make progress on climate change is huge. Governments don't have that capital, okay? You're not going to get it from philanthropy. And the private sector capital isn't all going to come there unless you've got the right incentives, because lending money or investing money at a loss is not a sustainable business model, right? And so, and China has been a real model in terms of how to do that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to come back to fintech in a minute in the financial system, because the private sector can do a lot. And you and I just talked a bit about some of the risk management tools that can be used in the private sector. I think the other thing that the private sector can do when we look at valuing nature is be pretty innovative in terms of creating new asset classes. And I'm looking to fintech here for some help, because you can see asset classes that are very valuable, right? We can imagine productive soil. That's an important asset class. Watersheds, a productive asset class. Pollinators. Now, my favorite one, which I want you just to address for just a minute or two, you come up with the idea, let's take the Amazon rainforest and let's take part of that public and equity market. And we're doing some work on that. Yeah. And so that's the potential. Now, what we've seen in China is this, in very simple terms, that I've worked in China for a long time, back to my days in Goldman Sachs. And what we've seen in China in terms of what they've done, in terms of, we've worked with them on protecting coastal wetlands, we've worked with them on national parks, but what they've done in terms of cleaning up dirty air, water, soil, it's been extraordinary. It's been extraordinary. And with their ecosystem inside the country, amazing. They need to do a better job outside of the country because they've got to have a big impact, on the global ecosystem. They need to do more. But one of the things that I've seen in China is their ability to create the right economic and regulatory incentives. And I'll use one example here. They chaired the G20 in 2015, and they set up a working group on green finance. And the Paulson Institute worked with them. And it was extraordinary how they, what came out of that in terms of some of the models that were developed globally, but what they're doing internally to put in place green stress tests for financial institutions, green bonds, a whole variety of things. And I look at this, you and I look at this the same way. It's hugely important in China, but as China is a model for the developing world, it may be even just as important. Because when we look at what's going to happen between now and, mid-century, there's going to be maybe another 3 billion people on Earth, many of them in less developed countries, in cities, and in countries where they don't even have municipal finance systems. And so we're going to need new financing mechanisms. Fintech, let's not forget fintech here. But there's going to also, the models that China has developed, I think, will be replicable elsewhere. And what they're doing right now, they're not making as much progress as I'd like to see, as quickly as I'd like to see it. But in terms of their carbon markets, they're working and say they're committed to developing a national carbon market. And when they do, it will be extraordinary. It'll have as much impact as anything on Earth to deal with climate change, because it'll be something that you can work in China and can be replicated all along the Belt and Road and elsewhere in the world. So again, a lot there going on, and a lot going on with fintech platforms in China.
Hank, as I listened to you and you picked on the private sector, which is so critical, one of the fascinating parts of this discussion on climate change is this huge push that is taking place now more than ever, I think, and the level of ambition coming from the private sector, big companies knowing that they, their employees, their suppliers, their shareholders want them to stand up and represent their values in terms of climate change. Yet, as they move forward, you see them doing a lot of, rethinking of how to do their productive processes. But it gets to a point where the choices are very difficult and there's a price option that needs to be taken into consideration. It's kind of, as you move to entirely renewable processes, what does that do to the price of products? How do you envision things like this being able to be constructed across that transition that is going to be required to really bring down the carbon footprint of many companies? It's fascinating to watch Fortune 500 companies beginning to set out and say, we'll be carbon neutral by 2030 or the latest by 2050. But how do you see kind of that evolution? Because it's going to require, I think, this moment that we're in, which if anything, you could characterize it as this huge push for innovation that we're living today like we've never seen before. It almost reminds you of the roaring 20s that started really precisely in the US after the so-called Spanish flu, where you again had this huge process of innovation as well. How do you think about things like this?
It's going to be very difficult. All those that say it's going to be easy are naive, because climate change involves three things. First, how do you produce the amount of energy we need to meet the growing demands and produce affordable electricity for those that are going to need it? Secondly, how do you decarbonize a global energy system that is 80% reliant on carbon-based fuels? And how do you prepare for the climate shocks, weather-related shocks that are going to come no matter what we do? So this is going to be difficult. That we're not coming close to meeting the UN targets. And if we did meet them, the Earth would still overheat. So I start by saying we still need research, more research on breakthrough technologies, things like direct air carbon capture. And then I believe we really need incentives. I've been a big believer for putting a price on carbon, which will raise a lot of money and can do it in a way in which it's not regressive and can help fund some of the other things that need to be done to respond to climate change. But I think we're going to continue to need innovation. I see the private sector playing a very big role and innovating, and because this is cumulative, so the carbon that's in the atmosphere, it's there unless we come up with technologies like direct air capture to remove it. And so it's all cumulative, and businesses will make a big difference because their customers are going to increasingly care. All of their constituents, their employees will, but they're not going to operate at a loss, and you can't expect them to do things. They're going to put them at a competitive disadvantage. So that's why it comes down to government policy, and that comes down to political will. Okay, and the fact is, if we make the changes that you and I would like to see made, the world is going to be a cleaner, better place. It's going to create jobs that are going to be more competitive. But the front end investment won't be synced up with the investment will be made in the front end. The returns will come farther down the road. There are some winners, there are some losers geographically, winners and losers. And there's a lot that's got to be done. And you focused on what the world has to do for those areas that are going to be the hardest hit by climate change in terms of the work you've done at IDB on disaster insurance and so on. So you and I both know this is a real battle.
Oh, these are great. Yeah, no, these are great points, Hank, and I think you've described it very well. The set of issues that we have in front of us, nothing is going to be easy. I think the part that makes me optimistic is, now more than ever, there's kind of, I don't know if it's COVID, I don't know what, the combination of kind of this cumulative set of challenges. The awareness level now, I think, is higher than I've ever seen it. And I think that's the beginning of a solution, because it's going to take humanity to innovate around this.
Yeah. And the thing that you and I have talked about, which is related to this, is young people, because young people are so important to this. And you and I both get asked all the time from young people, what career advice do you give us? And this is coming, this pandemic, we can't minimize it. It is devastating. It's a once in a century sort of thing. Everybody that's lived through this will remember it for their entire life. But I again would look at this as a glass half full problem, for young people, because guess what? The pandemic has shown a light on all the cracks and all the problems that were pre-existing. And those are all going to require solutions. And we're already seeing some, and job opportunities come out of that. But the other thing is and this pandemic is going to end. That's one thing we know about pandemics, right? They end. And so it's going to end. And when it ends, people that have gone through it are going to be more resilient. They're going to be more resourceful. They're going to be better prepared to deal with the world we're going to deal with in the future, which is rapid change. And so I still say to young people all the time that my career advice hasn't changed. The thing you need to do more than anything else is to learn. There's no perfect job, but there's a good job. There's a right job for you. You, as I said, you can almost as important as what you do is who you do it with. So I tell people, don't focus as much on your initial pay. Don't focus, on the long term. Focus here on learning, because that's what the long term is all about, learning and growing.
I know we have one minute left, but I know all this fintech community of very young entrepreneurial group of people that are listening to you. What is the one piece of advice you would give them? I mean, here they are growing their businesses at almost geometric rates. Things are happening, exploding. What are the one thing that you would tell them to focus on?
I would say focus. Sure, you've got to get through the night, but so some people that have got businesses that are falling apart, I don't have a lot of advice other than to say this is going to end, and you will learn a lot. But I think for almost everyone else, I'm saying focus on the future. This will end. You're going to emerge tougher and better for this. There's going to be all kinds of problems. Problems need solutions, and that creates opportunity. And so focus on opportunity and focus on learning. What can you learn from this experience? You will learn a lot. You'll be more resourceful. But again, my advice is always the same. Learn, and if you keep learning, you will find the right spot for you.
Well, that's a great way to end, Hank. It's a fascinating conversation as always with you, and I think leaving everybody in this forum thinking about how this too will end, but how much we learn from it is, and that process of learning is what's going to make a difference. So thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you all for listening today.
Thank you, Luis Alberto.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louis and Secretary Paulson, for an insightful discussion. This ends the two-part session on the discussion around climate impact and the response of the financial sector.